vibrant color.
Welcome all to the second class, Wardrobe here. So last week we talked about how to get into World War II miniature gaming through starter sets. This class I want to talk about the eras or timeline and theaters of the war and how they impact the way the games are played, generally speaking. Again, very high level, very opinionated, and so there are a lot of people may not agree with my suppositions here, but it kind of gives you a general idea. And so this will help you as you start to expand beyond those starter sets we talked about, or if you start out from scratch, like a lot of us did, getting into this hobby. So for example, both the main starter sets, the Hit the Beach and Band of Brothers that I talked about in the last class, those are what you would call Western Front, late war. But let's talk about the fronts or theaters first and kind of what typifies those and how it affects the gaming. And then I'll talk about the time periods. So theater. So let's go with West Front. So West Front is anywhere from Germany over to England, France, and maybe even into Denmark and all that. The land is typified by forests, fields, cities. Of course, they're all over, mountainous areas. That's kind of the same with almost all the areas. So, but the fighting is typical large sweeping kind of battles through some fields, some of the fields, and then also some city fighting, lots of countryside fighting, and what you hear about bocage, and then some hilly forest fighting. There's a lot of forest fighting. East Front. So this is Germany into Russia and down to the Caucasus, and this is typified by sweeping steppes, large, the steppes of Russia. So fields, just wide open fields. So more maneuverable for tanks. Some smaller villages, except for in Poland. But once they got into Russia, smaller villages until you got into the larger cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad. And there, of course, there was some mountainous fighting. In all these areas, there was all kinds of terrain for fighting because they covered such a large swath, right? Okay, so then you have the Mediterranean. And I'm going to look at Greece, Italy, Sicily, and the Middle East. Well, this is typified by rocky, craggy terrain, typically. So a little less maneuverability, a little bit more troop and infantry fighting, a little less tank fighting, though it exists, obviously. There's beach landings and airborne landings in that area as well. Then you have the desert. So this is really the northern part of Africa. And of course, this is desert. But there was some areas where there were green areas of fighting and wadis and all kinds of interesting, like a sea of terrain, but in sand. And I have I don't have much experience in desert fighting, but it is an interesting theater on which to go. Not a lot of heavy city fighting, maybe small villages. And that's what that typified by. And there's also beach landings in those areas as well. And then finally you have the Pacific. And now this covers a huge area, from India, Burma, all the way over to all the islands, including Alaska. There was fighting in Alaska and all around there. And then, of course, all the island hopping. And this is typically, I don't know a lot about the fighting in China and Burma, but it's typically jungle fighting, right, in Burma and all that. I think in the Chinese, Japanese fighting, it was a little bit less jungle, obviously, and just more rocky. You don't hear a lot about large tank battles and things like that, so heavily infantry. In fact, this whole theater is emphasized by a lot of infantry. And of course, a lot of jungles. There's mountainous terrain as well, and lots of beach landings, and even a couple paired landings. So those are the theaters, and that'll give you an idea of the kind of fighting that was going on in those areas, the kind of terrain to model. So like desert terrain, if you don't want to spend a lot of time on terrain, desert terrain's the way to go. And you can get away with having a more flat table, though there were lots of eddies and flows and wadis and things like that, dunes. But you can get away with a little bit less terrain, whereas if you go for jungle, it's going to be a more busy table and it's a little bit more complicated. Or if you go for a full city like Stalingrad. But these are some things to think about as you're getting started in the battles and the eras, the theaters you choose. Let's talk about the era, the timeline of the war. So there's the interwar period that is from basically between World War I and World War II, but I'm going to emphasize my pre-war area in the 30s, early 30s, 1930 to 1938. There's two conflicts that really stand out here. The Sino-Japanese battles, again, heavy infantry battles going on. There were some tank battles and stuff. I have not much experience in this area, so I'm sure there's some areas I'm fighting, but I always think of infantry fighting, and I did hear of some city fights and of course, countryside, hilly fights. And then you have the Spanish Civil War. This is where the Germans, a lot of the countries were testing their equipment and their philosophies about the battles to come that they were preparing for. So the armor is very light, and it's kind of reminiscent of World War I and then World War II mixing, like Stukas took part. But it's a lot of inter-country fighting supported by other troops. So again, a lot of gamers will kind of morph into that once they kind of get their solid foundation in their World War II. They kind of go into that area just to test out some different kind of, the weapons and the strategies and things. Then you have the early war. So this is 1939 to 1941, and you could probably even split 1941 in half. Because there's some major changes that happen. So this is typified by the Germans and Blitzkrieg, and the Japanese, and they don't call it Blitzkrieg, but they were blitzing and taking a lot of territory. So lots of victories on the Japanese part and the Germans part. So it's the Allies, if you're playing an Allied, so like the French or Russian or Commonwealth all over, or the Commonwealth in the Pacific or Americans, you're going to be doing fighting withdrawals. You're always trying to just slow them down. There's a little bit more disorganization on the Allied part on some of the armies because they just weren't quite ready for the type of battle and higher level command issues. So if you're battling and using an army in those things, it can be hard to command the troops. But it makes it fun because can you overcome that? The Germans are typically a little better trained and just kind of, they're better trained. The armor isn't necessarily better. It's not as much armor emphasis on armor, but there's a lot of armor battles to have. It's just lighter armor going at it. Though the Allies kind of surprised the Germans with some heavier armor that they came up against. But again, because of the command issues, there were struggles there. And in the Pacific, of course, there was island hopping and lots of people retreating and trying to fight off the Japanese. So then mid-war. On the West Front, 42 to 43, you don't hear about a lot because Germany is kind of consolidating their power and building their defenses for the next, the next stage, the late war. The Africa battle is really a back and forth battle. So what's kind of interesting there is you can, no matter which side you play, you're gonna have chances for offensive and defensive opportunities. The armor's a little better, and the Americans start getting involved there too. So if you want to play them in the desert, now they're not as well trained. So they really get their nose bloodied, and kind of the Americans learn a lot of things from here, whereas the Germans and British and Italians have been fighting for a couple years, so they're kind of the veterans of the group there. And then I said I'd talk about the East Front, and then in Pacific, again, the Japanese are still kind of steamrolling, but now the Americans and Commonwealth are starting to kind of make some inroads and starting to do some attacks, starting to do their island hopping campaign to an extent, and starting to see some victories. Again, light on tanks, but they do exist. And the infantry, again, everyone trying to get their kind of settle in the middle of the fight to try to figure out what's going on. And then, of course, you have the late war. So 44 to 45, we'll stick with the Pacific. Again, the Americans are really starting to do a lot more island hopping, a lot more landing, a couple paralandings. The fighting is typified by just two heavyweights just going at it. There's not a lot of surrender on the Japanese part at all, so you really have to weed them out. There's bonsai charges. The Marines are tenacious. Of course, the U.S. Army fights there, and just, and then Commonwealth and all the armies that are there to fight for them, India, Australia, all that. So there's all these different troop types that are fighting over the vast area, that is covered, geography that's covered by the Pacific. The desert's pretty much out of the picture at that point, and then there's the West Front, which is typified by D-Day. Both those starter sets that I talked about were both D-Day kind of box sets, and this is where the Germans, now the roles are reversed from early war to late war, and so now if you're playing the Germans, now you're on the defense, now you're doing fighting withdrawals. The Allies are starting to get their footing, and of course typified on the East Front and West Front by big tank battles, and also the armor is getting way better. So people really like playing this era because of the tanks, and a lot of people really like tank games. I'm not particularly one of those, but they really like the tanks because there's big armor, big cats as they call them. And the same thing's happening on the East Front. The Russians are kind of consolidating their commands better, and they're starting to really push in. The German troops the troop quality starts to get a little lessened on the German side because they're sapping their reserves of people. So then you start to see that change as well on both sides. So it would be interesting to play, say, the Russians throughout the entire war, and you start with them with the troop quality, I'll call them hordes or large armies, and the weaker, higher level command, and just a couple really good tanks. play them in the beginning in a fighting withdrawal pattern, and then you kind of get mid-war and kind of gain your ground, a little back and forth city fighting in Stalingrad, and then in the late war, now you start to be on the offense with a different triumph. So you can kind of learn and play different kinds of styles and grow your army with new and different equipment. So it's a pretty interesting way to go. Okay, so now you have a better idea of how the armies fight and how the theaters and time era might affect the kind of game that you're going to play. And this is the kind of thing I want you to think about. So I'm going to put some of these thoughts together on my blog post on the website, which will be linked below in the description. So go check it out, and you can just kind of see how some of the eras and stuff. I'm going to pretty much type out these notes on there and help you. Again, this is to help you start to decide, like, what kind of game do I want to play? What kind of gamer am I? Am I more defensive or offensive? Do I like the big tanks and cats, or do I want really infantry heavy battles? And that's kind of the point of this particular class, and I hope that's helped you narrow that down. The next class, we're going to talk about the scales and the different sizes of the troops you can play, from 2 mil up to like 28, 32 mil. So we'll talk about that next week to help you decide on that.
Hey kids, the narrator here because Wardrobe forgot to say something. Be sure to go into the description of the video to find the link to the website where we're putting all the resources and links to other source websites. And in fact, these 2 charts that Wardrobe showed here will be there as well. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next class.